Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's webinar, Boarding Schools Balancing Enterprise Risk Management and Student Care, a Practical Solution. Thank you very much for taking the time to attend this webinar. Look, my name's David Griffiths, Managing Director of CompliSpace. I think a number of you probably met me at the Boarding Australia conference recently. Today's webinar is very much around a practical application of essentially the boarding standards and enterprise risk. And a big focus of today is going to be providing a demonstration of the way that CompliSpace assists its 600 or so non-government school clients around Australia, and in particular its range of boarding school clients around Australia to actually manage their risk and compliance obligations with a very specific focus today on enterprise risk and indeed boarding risk in particular for schools. Just a quick bit of a recap before we get into it around CompliSpace. We, as a number of you know, really aim to simplify risk compliance and policy management for schools so that you can focus on teaching, learning and caring for students. That's a very simple sentence to say. It's often more difficult in practice. This afternoon, I'm actually going to show you just some ways in which we go through that process of simplifying risk compliance and policy management. As an organisation, we're very much content driven. Our organisation has over 80 staff and we have a number of content specialists within the business. We have a range of legally qualified staff, former business managers, former school principals, former teachers and so forth. So our focus very much as an organisation is to enable good policy management practices and policy content to come to life in schools. So hopefully I'll give you a bit of a feel for how that works this afternoon and enable you to contemplate that in your own school environment. Very quickly, if you do have questions during the course of this webinar, can you please use the console on the right-hand side of the screen just to jot some questions down. I'll endeavour to cover any questions that we have in the final 10 minutes or so. And if we do have a plethora of questions, either during the webinar or following, then I'll come out to each of you who have attended and actually answer those questions in writing. For your interest, we're also recording this webinar as well, so I will send a copy of it out to each of you if you wish to have any of your colleagues view it at any point in time. Okay, just another recap on CompliSpace and some of the schools that we provide our services to. Here's a broad cross-section of some of our independent school clients that have engaged our services over time and that we help around Australia. Probably a key message around this is really the differences between many of these schools. Some I'm sure you'd recognise and you'd probably relate to in different ways. I think the strong message there is schools here that provide a very broad range of services. There are high fee paying schools, there are low fee paying schools. The really important message is that all schools have a common challenge when it comes to risk compliance and policy management. And what we always seek to do is to help a school, irrespective of size, nature and scale, from a management perspective, to put stronger management systems in place to help them to actually address those risk compliance and policy management challenges. We have to get to know every single school client very well. That doesn't happen overnight. That takes time, and we enter into long-term relationships with our clients. So we do take the time to get to know them during the course of those relationships. And it's really, really important because we have to understand the DNA of our school clients. We have to understand in particular how change is managed within those schools, because a lot of what I'm going to show you today is going to look a little bit like a software approach to managing risk and compliance, but the reality is the underlying objective of it all is to influence human behaviour. And that's all about understanding how people operate within the school and how best to manage change within your school. We can't come into your school and tell you how to do that. We've got ideas, but you ultimately know the best way to manage that change. Over the years, we've also been engaged by a number of educational authorities and groups and some of the largest educational authorities in Australia. We've also been engaged by a number of systems, in particular Catholic education officers in different dioceses around Australia. Once again, a really important message there is that, again, we have to really get to understand those groups and authorities and systems, and each one is fundamentally different. And each Catholic system, for example, is fundamentally different, we find. And just because they look the same in profile or they look the same in terms of legal structure, they are always managed very differently. So once again, we have to actually spend the time or take the time to understand how they are managed. Let's have a quick look at some of the common challenges that we find in schools. I've put in front of you now essentially a great long list of challenges that schools face, sometimes every day, but generally speaking, when you look at that kind of smorgasbord of different challenges, you will face different among those at different points in time in your registration cycle or in your growth cycle as a school. Now, as you go through that list, today's focus is really going to be in the main part on three different challenges listed on there. First one, enterprise risk management. Second one, boarding. And the third one is the one that's common to every single school, irrespective of whether or not you're a boarding school. And that's the top one of policy management, maintenance and integration. Schools are policy-heavy zones, especially when you compare to many other industries. Schools are not afraid of policies. And if I think about your average boarding school, many boarding schools are quite old in nature. So you might have policies that have been around for a long time that have been written in different eras. It's not uncommon for us to go into a school and find policy content often having two policies covering the same issue, which may contradict one another. That's a genuine challenge for schools, that process of not just the drafting of policy, but the implementation, management, maintenance, and integration across all of the areas. And when it comes to the other 18 hours a day around boarding, that's particularly tough because we find that schools will have their base policies that operate during school and teaching hours, and then they might have, they'll definitely have additional policies, but with real overlap from those other school hours policies for their boarding hours. And that policy management approach is a genuine and huge challenge we find for schools. And that's the area that we focus on in the main part as a business, around making policy come to life and enabling good assurance processes and procedures to actually work in a school environment, ultimately to make it easier for staff to focus on teaching and caring in a safe and compliant environment. Now, we're going to focus, as I said, on enterprise risk and boarding in terms of those functional areas. So let's just jump in and refresh quickly around the structured frameworks on which the risk program and boarding programs in a school should now be built. If we look at something like risk, well, you might recall from my seminar that I went through I made the comment that we generally find that schools and staff in schools are actually, we find, experts in managing risk. They're experts at managing the risks in front of them every day. Where I think those staff and management teams and schools generally are often challenged is in this concept, more broadly speaking, of risk management. And what I mean by that is schools are often challenged, even though being experts in managing risk, they're often challenged at managing risk to a structured methodology. And these days, when we talk about risk management, we're talking about those good risk behaviours being fitted within a structured methodology. And that most common methodology now, as regulators, not just in the school sector, but across pretty much all sectors now, the common methodology that schools now benchmark to is the ISO 31000 risk management standard. So the slide that I've just put in front of you is a high-level outline of the principles, framework, and process for managing risk in accordance with ISO 31000. When we get into when we get into the actual process itself, that's on the right-hand side of the screen, and that's that traditional risk process of setting the context, identifying your risk, going through and evaluating and assessing and setting treatments and so forth. And that's what a lot of people think about when they think about the structure and process and the methodology for risk management. So in the course of the rest of this webinar, I'm going to actually show you some practical application of those good risk behaviours into that structured methodology so that you can contextualise and consider those for your school and how they might work in practice in your environment. The second part of what we're going to look at, and it's really closely related, is boarding risk in particular. And to that, I'm referring in particular to the boarding standard, the new boarding standard that has recently been introduced in Australia. This standard is made up of these 6 different steps and elements, and it's incredibly, as I demonstrated during the presentation recently, it's been very well thought through from a boarding risk management perspective. It is underpinned by the Enterprise Risk Management Standard. It references the Enterprise Risk Management Standard, and it's very much built around the risk management process. And as you go through each of these different elements and steps within the standard, within the boarding standard, you will find that you are identifying, going through, managing, assessing and managing the vast majority of your boarding risks through implementing this standard. That's why generally I make the comment around things like standards that if you are trying to manage your boarding compliance or compliance in other areas, go no further as a first step than to a standard, to use it as a roadmap for good compliance management and good risk management around these things. Okay, I'm going to now talk about what we actually do for our schools in a practical context and talk through how we actually help schools to actually manage their enterprise risks and implement enterprise risk frameworks, and indeed to manage their boarding risks in particular and implement the boarding standard through a boarding program. What is it we do for schools? Well, first and foremost, we provide them with a policy management platform and framework. It's through this, it's a web-based policy management tool called Fundamentals, and it's through this tool that we're able to provide schools with a huge range of different policy content that is kept up to date with changes in law, that's provided on a web-based communication platform for staff to use, and through which we're able to provide a basic staff learning system for training, testing and implementation of policy content, and for record keeping around that. Now, we in essence are a publishing company in some ways, and as content experts, we provide our content in a range of different modular areas. In particular, the modules that I've just put up on screen now, which include registration and compliance, the enterprise risk program and so forth. Looking at that different suite of modules, you can see there the enterprise risk program in the top line and boarding in the bottom row there. So they're just 2 of those key modules that are provided. The second part of what we do for schools is a really important piece, and that's the assurance piece. The assurance piece for schools to bring their risk and compliance obligations to life is absolutely critical. It's essentially a great big database with workflow, but importantly, with these sorts of tools, to some extent, we've found them to be almost commodity-like. The importance is not so much in the technology and the workflow, but far more in the content that you provide through it. It can be very much garbage in, garbage out if you're providing the wrong content through the tool. So there's always work to do around design, and we provide libraries of content around things like boarding risk and boarding compliance, and generally enterprise risk, enterprise compliance issues around that. Final comment I'd make is looking at the 2 together. if we think about policy management, that tells our staff and enables our staff to self-service in working out what they're meant to do from a policy context. So we want that to work really well and all staff to have access to it. The assurance piece tells us whether or not staff are doing it. Okay, and when you look at that in context, and this slide really puts it in that context, is that the building of these two systems for a school is not the hard piece. That can be done by having the relevant content with the school's content built into the same environment, publishing it and training staff, and then having good assurance reporting at the back end. The hard piece here is always around change management. And that's what I said at the beginning. It's around how do we actually get staff to actually change behaviours so that we're more risk aware and we're able to actually demonstrate that at a system level. Okay, on that note, I'm going to jump in and provide you with a quick overview at a system level of fundamentals and assurance, with a particular focus into enterprise risk and more detailed into the boarding program itself. So the screen that we're looking at now is a demonstration site for fundamentals policy management tool. This is a web-based application. It's delivered on a content management system. This means that a school has its own version of this, which is branded and customized and configured for that school, and it can take complete control of the content. A very important message around this is that a school's existing policies can be brought up into this same environment. And a large part of what we do during setup is actually an integration piece whereby we're reviewing and integrating schools' existing content with our various legally compliant policies so that it can work in practice for that school. Now, we're, for want of a better description, content specialists and provide our content in those modular areas. So jumping into a couple of those, in particular, enterprise risk. We provide a risk management program that's built out to the international standard, as mentioned. And really, without going into the depths of this program material that's in here, in essence, the risk program, we have configured this in great detail over time for schools. So it becomes your risk program. It sets your common risk language through the identification area and key risk classifications and the like. And it's a very well functioning program. The homepage here and the different areas in this that you can see form the backbone to your assurance piece, where you're actually capturing and managing your risks. Another key part of what we do in this is obviously the boarding program. And this is a new module that we've actually put quite an investment into building over the course of the last 12 months. And we're starting to roll out to our boarding clients now. The boarding program is built to the standard, and it basically tracks through that standard and maps out and builds out content that's then configured for your school and can demonstrate compliance with that standard. So I'm going to quickly touch on each of the areas in the boarding program now, before then going into the assurance platform, or just before that, talking about how it's actually implemented in practice, and then going through to the assurance platform to show how we capture some of the tasks and incidents and risks and so forth that arise. So jumping into the scope and general area. So as you can see, each of these pages dives much more deeply down into a range of different content areas that can demonstrate fulfillment of the of compliance with the boarding standard. The page here on how we apply the Australian boarding standards is a really important one, and in essence, whilst it's a very deep or a very lengthy web page, it actually shows us in detail a table that maps out each different section of the standard and then has a corresponding policy on program content that demonstrates compliance with each different section of the standard. So if you are implementing the standard in your school, a table like this is going to be absolutely crucial to be able to show and point to, and I guess filter out every different particular area so that you can demonstrate how it is that you comply with that. So What you'll also find is as we go through these different areas, that a number of these reference points for policy actually reference policies that are outside your boarding area. So an example here is I'm going to click on the student duty of care link there. That's taking us to our student duty of care homepage. And the message that I give you there is, just because we're building a boarding program that's quite specific to boarding, boarding just covers 18 hours a day. Obviously, the other 6 hours of teaching time in your school, there's a plethora of policy content that applies to the broader school community that has direct application and overlap with boarding. Many of your duty of care policies are exactly that. So the duty of care homepage, it's critical that that is linked to demonstrate how you then can fulfill your particular obligations under the boarding standard in that particular area. And in that case, it was for section 3.3A on policies and procedures relating to safety. So a big part of this will actually be linking in, and it's important to do that, all of those other policies from other functional areas, not just the boarding house or the boarding environment in a school. Going back into some of the other areas in the boarding module, which we'll just step through slowly, that gives you a bit of a feel for the overriding scope. Jumping into the governance and management section, I should mention that wherever you see asterisks, like the highlight that I'm doing right now, that signifies a merge or variable field. So the initial configuration of this actually enables you to have your site configured to exactly how you want your school to look and feel, as well as all of the words on the page and the references to those. So there are a whole bunch of merge and variable fields for configuration, and that's before you then go into customization of content to really suit any particular contextual needs that you have for your school. So looking at the governance and management section, you can see there's some of the different areas that this covers, and it is quite deep, okay? It is looking at things like critical incident, goes into great detail around that, and within a policy itself, you can see, again, merge fields, but linkages to many other relevant policy areas. Now, for those of you who are trying to do this in paper, it's an incredible challenge. Just a policy like this in paper form, if we were to link as appendices or as annexures all of the policies listed under the related policy section here, this policy itself in paper form ends up being about 45 pages long. That's an incredibly large document in a document form for busy teaching staff and busy supervisory boarding staff to find information as and when they need it. In fact, the feedback we always get from schools is that busy school staff, whether in the boarding house or supervising in the playground or indeed teaching staff, they have about 5 to 10 seconds to find relevant information. If they can't find it in that time, they often will have to stop looking and simply do what they think is right. That's a huge challenge, and a big part of our aim for schools is to help them to enable busy staff to find information in real time, to take that 5-second test and get that information as and when they need it. And that's a really important part of the idea of having this stuff on a technology-based platform that's text searchable, that links relevant policy content carefully and sensibly in all of the different areas that are needed. I hope that makes sense to everyone. There's always an element of, sometimes there's an element of bringing PDFs into a site like this, and over time web enabling the content. But having it available at the very least in a site like this is incredibly powerful for staff to be able to access it on whatever device they're using at a point in time. Now, onto some of the other areas, border protection, safety and wellbeing. I've kind of touched on that already in the importance of linking different areas, but in looking at these different pages and different key areas for the borders, I'll just touch on the health and wellbeing one specifically. I mentioned the importance of linking student duty of care program here. And again, this is so that busy staff can find the information thereafter, but then we dive quickly and easily, but then we dive down into some of the more boarding specific policies and so forth. If we take something like the Border Injury, Illness and Health Services policy as an example, you'll see there in here, because this is a demonstration site, I've actually still got the variables up there. So during the implementation and setup for a school, all of these variables are filtered out and it all becomes the school's content as we go through. But that should give you a feel for the nature and depth of the content in that sort of an area. Most important message I can make and reiterate when it comes to issues like this is just ease of use and the user experience with this content is absolutely critical. I always go back to that issue of if we want busy people to use it, it's got to be easy around these sorts of things. Just covering some of the other, or touching on some of the other areas, mapping out the standard and demonstrating how we do this. The boarding staff area is an important one because when we go through this and we touch on things like health, safety and wellbeing of staff, that points very quickly to our WHS, OHS, OSH program, depending on which state you're residing. So it's really, really important, this one, because when we first started working in the school sector some years ago, you know, with my background as a lawyer, I would often find that, and this is some years ago now, that culturally within a school, I'd find that student safety was a huge priority, and sometimes work health and safety, or OH&S as it then was, probably wasn't as developed as some of the student safety areas and duty of care areas. Nowadays, we're finding that schools are far more mature in relation to this area, but it's really important from a boarding perspective that work health and safety, or OH&S, OS&H, that it doesn't live alone in a vacuum in a boarding house, that it extends to every part of the school. And it's therefore crucial that a school also has a broader work health and safety program in place, that has work safe policies, that have all of the other 6 hours a day type policies, the teaching hour policies in there as well, and that they're very readily and easily linked to boarding policies. I think what the key message there is that compliance in any functional area, let's call it boarding house compliance, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. And that's an absolutely critical message. It needs to interact, it needs to integrate, and that's that issue of policy management, maintenance, integration. It needs to integrate with other functional areas of your school, whether it be work health and safety, whether it be facilities generally, whether it be, you know, over to general duty of care. It absolutely there needs to be some level of interaction, integration with those areas for this to work successfully. As you look at that page, you see other areas as well that touch on that more broadly, pointing back to the risk management program, which I'm selecting now, and then into general policies and procedures around things like lockdown procedures, evac, general bullying and things like that. So that gives you a bit of a feel for, again, the importance of the boarding program being quite a gluey program that can easily link and glue to other relevant areas of your school so that it actually works in practice. That's a very important message. Finally, some of the other final areas, we touch on boarding, parents, family, community engagement. There's quite detailed content in here. Again, you will have existing content in different areas. Some of that you'll elect to push over the top of our content and turn ours to draft. Other, you'll archive in accordance with your records management policy. And if you don't have a records management policy, we'll put one in place. The most important thing here is that this content is built to work for your school, because if it doesn't work in practice in a very practical way, then it's no good having it. It absolutely has to work in practice. Otherwise, it's more of a marketing document than an actual document that's really designed to create a safer and a better environment, which is really what you're all after by putting these sorts of programs in place. Final thing is on boarding facilities. And you can see as soon as we dive into boarding facilities, a lot of links to other areas. And these areas have a range of different content. What we've also had to do is actually deal with some of the different state regulatory requirements around facilities and so forth, as you can see. So for other states other than New South Wales and WA, they have a compliance policy that covers, that's quite specific. New South Wales and WA have their own. That's where I make my usual complaint about the Federation of States, because we really shouldn't be that different when it comes to these things. Don't take that as a political statement, but it's just reality when we think about things like child protection and working with children checks and all of those sorts of different compliance requirements. It makes no sense in the cold hard light of day for us today to have a different approach to these things across state boundaries. So let's hope that the Royal Commission recommendations will actually have an effect on state governments to get together, like the majority of them have with WHS, and create a more uniform approach to this. Be that as it may, that is the environment in which we're operating. And for those of you who might have facilities in other states as well, you do need to be mindful of this when it comes to your boarding programs. I know a number of you do operate schools and campuses across borders. You also need to be mindful of this more broadly speaking from a risk and compliance perspective, in particular, like I said, around areas of child protection, in particular around some of the very specific areas of duty of care. A good example is anaphylactic shock management, where in Victoria, the Victorian schools are required under their ministerial order to have a slight deviation in what we'd see as the standard practice around anaphylactic shock. I know the Victorians might argue that the rest of us have a deviation on that, but that is what it is. So those are some of the areas to be very mindful of, those changes. Now, we're always reviewing those changes, and we're reviewing what happens, what bills are tabled before Parliament on the state-specific areas, and we keep that content up to date with those changes in law so that schools are always able to publish their updated policies in real time and get the corresponding tools around those updates to communicate that properly to staff, to exec team members, to board members, and the broader community if need be. Just jumping back over now onto onto the boarding program, that gives you a feel for what I'd describe as the web-based program document. Key messages around that. It's configured for the school, must be configured and customized so it works in practice, must link to other policy content outside the scope of very boarding specific. So must go beyond the 18 hours a day approach for boarding and into those 6 hours a day teaching timeframe type policies, because there's always overlap. So don't think your policies work in a vacuum in the boarding house. The other key part of this is, of course, the implementation of the program. So, and that's all about how do we get the human beings, how do we get busy staff to interact with this? It's not just about if we build it, they will come. One of the key things is having it on a web-based system like this to share other knowledge on that system and other content so that you can use this as a single source of policy truth for staff. But another key aspect of this is having training in place. So wherever we've got legally inspired policy content across a range of different areas, we've built out corresponding training content. So for things like the boarding module, we've built a range of, the boarding program, we've built a range of different training modules for staff to be able to complete. These are short modules. They're designed to be done in about 5 minutes. Okay, and they're actually allocated through the staff learning system that sits in the back end of the system here. They're not designed to give staff necessarily at this point that deeper accredited level of knowledge. It's really designed as compliance training at this point to ensure that staff are policy aware, that they're procedure aware, that they know how to identify an issue and where to find information if an issue arises. I'll just jump in and show you an example of one of the courses. Here's an example here around, if we pick up any of these courses, really, they will tend to actually be pretty good. something around bullying or something like that, first question is always the same: have you completed the quiz? Last question is always the same: an acknowledgement that you've read and understood. So that really closes off that accountability loop for a staff member. And when we actually get into, when we get into the actual test results, we can actually see how that staff member has gone in that particular test. In this particular case, I did today a quick quiz on one of the boarding modules, and this was border protection, safety and well-being. So it shows that I got 50% on that. Clearly, I didn't really take the training very seriously when I went through that. The actual training itself is built into those modular areas, and look, it works pretty well. So if I just touch on what a training module looks like, I'll show you the one that I did today. Then really these come up and effectively as PowerPoint slides. Some of them are in video and so forth, and staff members can go through them in their own time and on a device and just get a feel for the nature of the content that way. So look, it's very effective for actually capturing all of those points in all of those areas and being comfortable with that. Of course, that's not the only way to train staff. That's a good systematic way to train staff to ensure that they're very policy aware. Perhaps some of the more, I guess, beneficial ways of training staff beyond that are the face-to-face time that you will spend with staff. And really what this is designed to do at that systematic level is to ensure that when you do have face-to-face time with your staff at PD opportunities at beginning of term, at end of term, or whenever it may be, that it's much more valuable time that you're spending with them face-to-face, that you're focusing on scenarios and you're focusing on workshops and sensitive issues and big issues, knowing that your staff are policy aware because you have the records to demonstrate it. And it culturally says to staff, we take this stuff seriously. We expect you to know it. We don't expect you to remember it all, but we expect that when an issue arises, you know where to find it. And that's a really important message. So that covers off your policy management piece around boarding and to a certain extent around risk. Now, the way in which I'm going to just touch on quickly assurance. What assurance is all about is really about the capture of incidents, the capture of risks, and the assessment of risks, and the capture of compliance performance. The way in which the majority of staff will only ever interact with assurance is by logging an incident from time to time. So having a link on the fundamentals platform to something like your incident management form, having staff able to access that on their iPad, on their iPhone, or whatever the case may be, or the device, and being able to upload that information quickly as opposed to it being on a paper form somewhere, it's incredibly powerful. I've just clicked on a staff injury here, and that's just opened up a whole swagger of other conditional information that I need to provide for that particular incident. Now, when that incident is submitted, that will actually generate workflow and email through to whoever you need it to go to, depending on the incident. And I note in boarding houses, we'll often find that boarding related incidents will go to multiple people, depending on the nature of the incident, depending on the house, depending on the student, depending on the age, all sorts of things. And the beauty of this is that when that incident does occur, we're able to track and manage that whole flow of information. So when that information comes through, I'm now logging into the assurance system and looking at a manager view of the assurance system. When that incident does occur, if I'm one of those people who needs to be informed, I would receive an email. It would have a link on it saying an incident's just occurred, and it would bump me through to this triage screen, or it might, if I wished it to, bump me all the way through to the incident. I can click on that incident straight away, and I can see I've got a boarding safety related incident, and I can then filter through the different information. And in this case, I can see that John Smith has actually logged an incident relating to an injury to a student named Dan Jones, and he was injured whilst playing Sunday afternoon house football, and he had a head clash with the goalpost. We can go through that and see that he suffered a concussion, and that the duty mistress, Jane Jones, was on duty, and Jane did the concussion test. Really importantly, as an incident owner at my level, I can actually go into that. And the first thing I want to do straight away is actually start some workflow on the back of that incident to ensure that it's managed properly. So in this case, I've set up an accident investigation. I've actually assigned it to myself here. That's due tomorrow, and I can see the status of that at any point in time. I can go in and see, right, okay, we're currently in progress. Now, when I receive that email to say, have you done this yet? Do an investigation, I have to go in and say whether I'm compliant, non-compliant, or in progress. So that's a typical compliance type task covering a particular incident. Now, the other aspects of this particular incident that are really important when you're managing these things from a reporting perspective are to actually link that incident to a relevant risk. Because if you think about it, incidents from a risk management perspective, from a broader risk management perspective, incidents are a classic lead or lag indicator of risk. They give you an indication of whether or not you've got an emerging risk or whether or not there's a risk in a particular area. So if there's a concussion on a Sunday footy match, we can see straight away we're going to link that to border health and wellbeing risk. We could link it to a duty of care risk. I've probably overcooked that, to be honest, on how many risks I've linked it to, but it's just to demonstrate the issue. So that means that when I'm having a look at those risks, or if I'm an owner of that risk, I can now get a notification to say, you've just had an incident that relates to border health and wellbeing risk. You need to be in the loop on this, and you might need to reassess your risk depending on the nature of the incident. As I said a little earlier, we generally find that schools are experts in managing the risks in front of them. Where we find they often struggle is with the best of intention, trying to do things like what I'm showing you here, trying to link risks with incidents and trying to link control tasks and treatment tasks and things like that in manual paper-based or Excel-based type approaches. We find that they really struggle with that level of complexity around that. And what we've built here is the ability to do that in a much simpler way, together with libraries of different risks and compliance tasks and so forth for schools to be able to pick and choose from. In actual fact, what we normally do when we go through the setup, or we always do in fact, is we actually, applying the KISS principle, just keep it simple with the school, start very high level with various risks, don't go too deep too quickly, and compliance type tasks, and we release and launch those tasks to start with and those risks to start with, depending on the nature, profile and complexity of the school. So the assurance tool doesn't just do incident management, as you can see. The risk management module, I'll dive into some of those risks to show you what that looks like. And this is really, I'm focusing in on boarding risk, but understand that's in the context of boarding as just one risk category in an enterprise risk register. It's one of many. So if we look more broadly at it at an enterprise risk library, I'm now going to show you what that looks like. And in this context here, the page that you see in front of you is an example of a library of different risks that might apply in a school environment. And a school can then launch those and link those into its risk register and can assign those risks to an individual. Looking at the very boardings, and so, sorry, I'll just scroll down a little bit and you can see the sort of nature, and this goes on for, there's quite a bit of different risk content built into this library of risks. But a school will adopt, adapt, amend, add their own, all of that sort of stuff, build those risks into a broader risk register for them, and importantly, assign them to individuals to actually take charge of and take ownership of those risks, and then monitor, review and assess those risks from time to time. And it may be that that rolls on a rolling rotation or a rolling frequency. It may be that a risk assessment occurs whenever an incident occurs relating to that risk, or there's a compliance issue relating to that risk. The point is that the system triggers a lot of that, and it's very powerful. Jumping into, say, some of the boarding risks specifically, this next library shows you a range of different boarding risks, and there's quite a fair bit of detail in there. I'd emphasize at this point that when you see the level of detail of different types of risks in that risk library, you don't assign all of those risks and adopt all of them at once. you start at the high level risks and build them into your register and assign them and get them moving. And over time, some of those risks will be more operational in nature, and you'll adopt them as you mature over time as an organisation. Now, just showing you what a risk register looks like, I've pre-run a couple of reports to show you a risk register. Here's an example very quickly of a boarding school risk register. Just diving straight into it. At the top end, and this is a typical risk report, we see a nice little heat map of where risks sit. I'd normally expect them to sit far more broadly around that heat map. The reality is that some risks you're always going to be in the red zone. It's the nature of the beast. You know, boarding environments are high risk environments, and whilst you can have very strong risk mitigants and controls in place, there are certain risks that might always have a potentially catastrophic outcome, and it's really about dealing with the controls as best as possible and the impacts as best as possible. So going into that register, some basic info on reporting and breakdown, and then we get into the register itself. And this particular register actually shows you the different risks, the description, the potential consequence, likelihood and consequence and rating overall. And then importantly, it shows you this column here, which it being a new register, we haven't seen any movement, but that's really important for sort of steady state risk registers where you can see movement over time if a risk goes up or down. And that from a management perspective just gives you an opportunity to ask the question why, and to ask what else do we need to do if a risk has gone up. So that shows you a risk register in basic terms. Just going back to the main homepage, what this tool also does is it enables us to deliver to you various tasks that help to control risks, and it enables you to create your own tasks that help to control risks and that help you to fulfill your compliance obligations. So if we pick on an example of a task, I'm just doing a search in here for boarding in particular. Here's an example of various tasks that we've helped to map out from the standard. And what this shows you from an assurance perspective is not only have we mapped out the standard to the risks that relate to the standard, but we've also mapped out the various tasks that in a question-based format that should be allocated to individuals to show that they're fulfilling their obligations or requirements under the standard. This is the template of a task, and in assigning that task, that individual would receive an email asking them that question essentially, and they can put in the compliant, non-compliant, in progress piece. Just to close off before asking for any questions, this particular tool has a range of other functionality associated with it. It's very, very powerful. I'm reluctant to go into too much detail in these sorts of webinars because it's normally very specific to what a school's needs are. The most important thing it does is it enables you to capture any field of information and report on any field. What we do with this is come to the table with a huge amount of dynamic content covering a whole range of compliance areas, both legal and organisational, and a whole range of risk areas. And we build those in such a way that they're able to link together and can result in you being able to provide very simple reports, whether it's a board risk report, which would only have, you know, a report like this that I've already actually run, which would only have a smaller number of risks in it, whether it's a boarding risk report or a risk task framework. The really important thing is that you're actually after really good real-time information. We need to turn data into real-time valuable information that you can then report on and make good management decisions at the end of. Now I'll open up to any questions that have come through. The first question is just simply, the first question is asking what other content modules are relevant for a boarding school other than the boarding module. Look, the first issue I'd say to you around that, or the short answer to that is a number of content modules are relevant, but it depends on what the school already has in place. A big part of what we do for schools at the beginning of a process, if you like, an engagement process, is we actually start by going through what we call the evaluation process. And it is a process that takes us quite a bit of time, but it's a small time commitment from a school, whereby we actually have a look at what their current situation is by way of policy management. What do they have in place? How do users access policies? What does their content coverage look like? Now, it may be that during the course of that process, we find that, look, their work health and safety, a school's work health and safety policies include just a policy statement, but really don't have a working program, that there are improvement areas that we identify in a range of safety procedures and policies, and that's pretty common, to be honest. It may be that we find that there are duty of care areas where we'd like to bolster up a bit and help to improve those, that indeed child protection is still a bit static and requires updating. So those are examples where in that particular case, I would say that, look, the boarding program will work very well, but it really needs to be complemented with those modules like safety, duty of care and child protection as an example. Certainly from an enterprise risk perspective, if a school doesn't have an enterprise risk program in place along the lines of the program, the homepage of which I'm going to now, then if it's wishing to practice enterprise risk, it most certainly needs a program like this. If a school board is asking for better risk reporting, start with enterprise risk. Absolutely. That is the only way that you're going to get better reporting up to the board. You can't do it in any other format, because if a regulator or a board member that knows anything about risk comes along and wants to see risk reporting, if you're doing your reporting to your own version of what you think risk should look like, you're going to have to explain yourself. You're going to have to articulate and outline your whole process, and you're doing that to a person or people or organisation who would normally benchmark against an existing process, which is the one in front of you of ISO 31000. Another question, can CompliSpace import policies from other risk management software? In terms of importing policies, short answer is really it depends on what other software you're using and how we need to import those policies. We can certainly link to policies from other software. So a lot of schools will use learning management systems, student admin systems, the combination of all of the above as their sort of single source of policy truth, if you like. And what we'll often do when it comes to fundamentals is integrate this with, integrate fundamentals with their other policy portals, if you like. And that's through linking and things like that. What that also raises is some technology issues around single sign-on and other things that I won't go into great detail on here, but we always have to go through those issues quite carefully to get the best possible user experience at the other end. When it comes to specific risk management software, we provide an assurance tool that we think is best in breed. It is rich in policy, in content around risk and compliance. We don't provide our content for other risk software for it to be built into other risk software, and that's a really important message. There's a reason for that, is because the content works very well within this framework, and we've distributed a number of those assurance software applications over the years, and we've really come back to this one now as the basis on which we are now putting a huge amount of development work specific for schools in Australia, because we think it's the best one there is for schools and their specific needs. Another question, do you provide a package for boarding only? That is a very good question. It goes back to my first, the answer to my first question, to be honest. And it's not going to be an answer that you necessarily want to hear, but it's the big one of it depends what's in place already. And what I'd urge you to do is you know, we'll have a separate conversation and go through an evaluation to work out if you've got what you think you need to have in place in the other areas that can be easily linked in. And if you don't have it, we can fill it. If you do have it, it's just an easy function of linking it straight in. Final question is it possible to implement the boarding module first and then implement other modules later? Yes, it is, subject to what I've just said around some of the small gaps in the other areas. Now, that, dare I say it, will become a your own risk-based approach to how you want to launch boarding. Let's be really clear. The content that you've just seen around the boarding module provides a huge amount of boarding specific content, and it also provides links to other broader modular content from other modules across your school. Now, where you don't have that content, there may be gaps. There may be big gaps, there may be small gaps. You may wish just to have the skeleton of the boarding module to get going, just in the boarding house, and then fill those gaps over time. For us, in terms of recommending that approach, it completely depends on a school's current set of circumstances. And that, again, is about evaluating that together to work out what's going to be the best approach. And a quick example as to where it might be an appropriate approach is if a school has some of the other modular areas, but might have resource shortages in terms of personnel to implement this, and has a very high priority to get boarding moving quickly. That might be an example where you take a short amount of time at the beginning to get boarding moving, and then some short amount of months down the track, you subscribe to another module or build another module to build in and improve that. What I'll absolutely say to you around all of these programs and programs like boarding is it's not about perfection, it's about progress. And that's what risk management is about. If we wanted perfection, there'd be a very simple way to have a perfect risk management program. A perfect risk management program would in actual fact get rid of all of our risks, because it's impossible to have perfection in risk, okay? And a risk program getting rid of all of our risks involves us shutting the front gates, shutting the boarding house, and not letting them back in. That's not realistic. So what this is about, it is about actual progress rather than perfection. It's about improvement over time. And your boarding program will always be on the mend and on the improve. It will be improved by us as we update policies, and across other areas, it will be improved by you as you identify areas. It'll be improved by you suggesting areas for us to improve, and by other people around your school to improve that. Just on that note of policy updates, another question came in around how we notify schools and aid them in the update of policies around legislation and legal parameters. So we have a range of different ways in which we update schools around different legal updates and so forth. Many of you would subscribe to our schoolgovernance.net.au weekly news feed. That is at a really high level how we update the broader school community in Australia to different issues around schools. But for subscribers of different modules here, what we in essence do is that when we're constantly monitoring new laws, constantly monitoring new standards, new areas of best practice. And in addition to that, across our 600 or so schools in Australia, there's a constant community of schools who are asking us if we have a policy on this or that. So we push that back through our research and editorial team and get them to draft it up. Then we test it with schools before releasing it more broadly to those subscribers of the relevant modules. When we roll out a new policy change, and if we take an example around something like duty of care, for example, it may be that we're rolling out a new asthma management policy to our schools. When we roll that out, we actually upload it in draft on all of our school sites. We communicate with schools in various ways, by email, even down to by telephone individually, but we'll have a newsletter that might go out to individual schools saying, it's a new asthma management policy in draft on your site. You should publish it by this date. If you haven't done it or have any questions, then come back to us. And then we will, then it's very easy for the school to go to the content management system and hit publish, and they can do it themselves. We're also monitoring our schools' usage, and if we find that some schools haven't actually published content that they should have, we'll be following up with them, and sort of our service team will follow up with them to say, hey, why haven't you published this? You should have. What do we need to do to help? Where it's a significant change that also includes training, that would also point to the training updates and quiz updates and things like that. Some changes, let's take child protection, might involve a rollout of a whole program. And in that case, in particular with Victoria last year, and we anticipate this around the rest of Australia after December of this year, we actually ran a whole lot of workshops that invited all of our schools to workshops for a much broader rollout of content updates. The final thing I'd say about content updates is we always try to put ourselves in the shoes of a busy business manager or HR or safety manager. So if we're rolling out content updates, we also try to give them a hand with some copy for an email as an example that they can cut and paste to shoot that out to staff if they need it. So it's all about practicality, and it's all about these things actually coming to life in a real school environment. Okay, that pretty much concludes the presentation today. I would like to thank you all for taking the time to attend. As I said, in the next 48 hours, well, not the next 48 hours, in the next couple of business days, we will actually distribute a recording of this to you all if you should wish for any of your colleagues to watch this and get a feel for it. I've put my details up on the screen. Do feel free to make contact if you have further questions. We'd be delighted to have a chat with you more broadly around your needs, or more specifically around your boarding needs, but more broadly around your enterprise risk needs in your school. I would urge you all a couple of final messages here. It's about the practical application of policy management systems. That's the really important thing for engaging busy teaching and other staff to do what it is you want them to do. It's all about practicality. It's all about the 5-second rule. And very importantly, when it comes to boarding houses, boarding doesn't operate in a vacuum. There is overlap with many different areas of the school. So having a system or systems that can interact and integrate with one another in this way will enable you to bring good content to life, and will enable and help you to manage that change with your staff. But it will not happen overnight. It is a journey. And that's what the big message is about risk management. It's a journey, not a destination. I'd like to thank you all for attending and wish you all a good Friday afternoon. Many thanks.